All right, welcome to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. We're continuing our study called Rethinking Reality, which is our attempt to understand the thought of Jonathan Edwards through the ideas and thought of George Berkeley, since they shared a very similar philosophy. Berkeley is easier to read than Edwards is in this particular area of philosophy, and therefore we're kind of using him as a jumping stone in order to understand Edwards. So I just want to briefly review that with some other general things. Another thing with the study goals is to understand the intent of both Berkeley and Edwards. They were both responding to the same thing in their area of philosophy. They were arguing against matter, realism, atheism, and I haven't had this written up there, but also skepticism. That's what they're attacking, and for the purpose of establishing or confirming or demonstrating the existence of God, the soul, and of course to reform science, because they believe science was heading down a very dangerous road. So that's the general thrust of the study, some of the things that we're going to be going through. The main arguments that we've gone through so far that Berkeley has employed, I've given labels. The relativity argument, the identity argument, and the qualia knowledge argument. The relativity argument has to do with different perspectives in regards to sensing an object. So one person tastes something, tastes sweet, another person tastes sour to them, or they both have a taste that they would call sweetness, but one gets pleasure from it, the other one gets a discomfort or displeasure. However, if the sensation itself was in the object, the idea would be the same for both. Now that's the relativity argument. The identity argument is the idea that I can have contrary sensations with the same object. I can put two hands in the same water that's designated at a temperature, intermediate temperature, let's say 65 degrees. One hand will say cold to me, the feeling. The other one will feel like it's hot. Now these would be, we would have contradictory sensations in the one object. However, if sensation was in the object itself, they should be the same. There's a violation of the identity, which of course A equals A. Now, the qualia knowledge argument is an argument that's used right now in the philosophy of mind for demonstrating consciousness. However, I found it in Berkeley that he's using it for a slightly different reason. He's using it to establish that, for instance, a person may say that sound is the sound waves that vibrate and touch my eardrum. Okay? And you can actually take this further and say that, okay, synapses in the brain firing, that is redness, the experience of redness. However, the argument issue here is, and I use this example, the original knowledge argument written by Frank Jackson argues that, well, if you have a person who is colorblind or has never seen any like redness before, only been in a black and white room their whole life, and in that room they study all the synapses of the brain, all the functions of the brain, they study testimonies on a black and white screen, they study wavelengths of light. They study all the different information for a physical account of that experience. However, when that scientist leaves that room for the first time in her life and sees the color red, she has learned something new. The physical objective account of the sensation did not exhaust the definition. So she left the room, saw redness for the first time, it was something new. Looking at the synapses of the brain, the wavelengths of light, the testimonials, did not exhaust it. In fact, it's arguable that it didn't give you the experience of redness at all. And this is the knowledge argument. And Berkeley uses this argument in the book as well, in different points. Now this is just review. Now here's the next one. We just started this last week, was the primary versus secondary quality distinction. Primary qualities are extension, solidity, motion, and mass. Now, secondary qualities are color, taste, odor, sound, and there's more under each category. I just put a few for an example. Now, John Locke, following this idea going all the way back to Democritus, would argue that the primary qualities are in the object, okay, mind independent, but these ones are in the mind. Now, Berkeley has gone through and tried to demonstrate that these ones here, only so far, are in the mind. He's just now starting to argue against primary qualities. And in doing this, he wasn't really responding to much of anybody, because most philosophers, even in his time, would have argued that color, taste, odor, sound, those did exist in the mind. Locke would even admit that the secondary qualities were in the mind. He would argue that these ones were not: extension, solidity, motion, and mass, and other ones under that same type of category. Now that we've gone through these ones, in fact, we finished this up, the last time we finished color, now we're going into the primary qualities. Now we just started with extension last week, and we're going to be continuing, finishing through the primary qualities, because he goes through them quite fast. Because there's a lot in this, our knowledge of these, that depend on these. And so it's going to be a lot quicker, a lot faster for Berkeley to go through them. So from the last study, jumping right over, we finished secondary qualities with color, using these arguments, the relativity, identity, and the knowledge argument. And now we're going in, and we did extension. And I don't know if anybody remembers the examples we used. It's been 2 weeks. I've had a break, having a baby and being sick, and all the different things that go on in life. The relativity argument that he used was, if extension was in the object, then it would be the same to me and to, let's say, a mite. However, it's not the case. Okay, a mite's foot, for instance, to the mite itself, looking at its own foot, perceiving it, looks quite normal in comparison to the rest of its body. However, to me, I can't even see the mite's foot without the aid of, let's say, a microscope. Likewise, a much smaller life form might see the foot of the mite to be huge. However, if extension, the experience of extension itself were in the foot of the mite, it would not be relative to different perceivers. It would be an absolute presenting itself to the mind. However, it's relative from mind to mind. Now, are they different objects, or do the object exist in the mind? That's sort of the question. Now, the identity argument in this case, which, by identity, I'm always referring to the law of identity, the law of logic. The example was distance. Okay, so when I travel to the Pittsburgh skyline on my way to work, I can take my hand like this, and I can place that building between my fingers. Now, if extension, okay, size, was in the object itself, and it's presenting itself perceptually to my mind, it would be a constant. That is, the extension as it is in the object, direct presentation to my mind. It would be the same all the time, but it's not. It changes from frame to frame in experience. And we'll get into Edwards' occasionalism at a later time to help explain this, and this is similar with Berkeley's view, to help explain this understanding of reality. However, what these things did was, if extension was in the object, it would remain constant, but it isn't. So that building isn't small, and then when I get up close to it, huge. It isn't huge and small. That'd be a contradiction if it's in the object. Now if it's in the mind, it's different. It wouldn't be a contradiction. It would change itself from frame to frame. And so these two principles were used to show that extension, which was a primary quality, was, like other secondary qualities that were covered, also existing in the mind. Now, those were the last study. That was general review. It was very quick and fast. Have some new people here today. So I'm going to let you guys ask me some questions.
Well, I wasn't in I haven't seen the previous proofs that you've used for proving that secondary qualities are in the mind. Are you saying that they are in the mind only?
In the mind? Well, in the mind isn't necessarily talking about just my mind in particular. We're not talking about solipsism. So what the Berkeley Edwards thesis would be is, and to use a quote from Edwards, would be that all things subsist in created or uncreated consciousness. So it's revealed from the mind of God directly to the minds of men. So set all objects, okay, let's say a chair, its definition could be exhausted by sensible qualities. Now, those sensible qualities and the way they're organized under this system, and I'm kind of like pointing to something we're not getting to quite yet, but just to kind of give you an idea of what Edwards is talking about, what they're talking about with this, is that the sensations in the object are organized in that way and revealed to my mind as is. So when I see a chair, it's because God's revealing a chair to me, quite literally. So literally revealing it from his mind to my mind. So that's the idea of being in the mind. It's not necessarily isolated within the space of my own head, all right, or in a sort of a solipsis sense. Okay. Rather, the nature of the object is mental. So that is, if in the way Edwards would probably prefer to state it is, he would use the term mental in a philosophical conversation, but talking with someone in his congregation, he would say it's revelatory in character. And so he would probably use those definitions almost synonymously. Does that help?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions along those lines? Any objections right off the bat? I'm not claiming to be a full-blown defender of the ideas quite yet, but I do find some notions compelling. So if there's any questions or concerns or objections right off the cuff, I can try to answer them before we continue into the reading. Good? All right. All right, welcome back. We just completed the reading, going through the primary qualities, and we see that Berkeley's critique, speaking through finalness. We covered motion, solidity, and we also covered a section in this where he's dealing with abstract concepts. He's actually speaking indirectly here against rationalists like René Descartes. Locke also critiqued René Descartes, and Berkeley spends actually an extended period of time in the principles dealing with the rationalists, but he only spends a little bit of time in the dialogues, because I think many of his audience have already rejected a lot of the ideas of the rationalists, the continental rationalists. But he felt that it was worthy to go into those. In fact, he would actually feel that even a person who would argue that sense experience is the basis for understanding physical reality, such a person, if fearing that physical reality isn't, fearing that it could be mind dependent, would actually retreat to rationalism. And so he feels that he needs to address that as well. He wants to try to cut all the exits off from the person he's critiquing. So the first one we covered was motion. Can somebody explain, now this is a little bit of a harder section of the dialogue, probably the hardest we've had so far, but how does he define motion?
Is extension?
No, it's
No.
not extension. He will be referring to extension and dealing with motion shortly, but not at this moment. The word reciprocal is used.
Yeah. Who talks about different, one person that's moving
Before that.
before that?
That's where. Well, the 1 mile per hour versus 3 miles per hour.
Yeah, it might be a little bit after that, actually. Reciprocal.
Well, that's
That's what I was talking about.
Oh, that's what you're talking about? Okay,
Yeah.
say it.
A body that describes a mile in an hour moves 3 times faster than it would in case it described only a mile
Okay,
in
continue.
3 hours. Is not time measured by the
That's
succession of ideas in our minds.
Oh, no, that wasn't it.
Oh no.
All right, well, anyway, it's a relationship between... You got it?
Is not motion of a body swift in a reciprocal proportion to the time it takes up in describing any given space?
Okay, no, that's correct. All right, what he's saying here is, how are we defining motion? The definition he's giving, and I'm sure there could be a huge debate between Newtonian and Einsteinian physics and get into those sort of things, but the way he's defining motion here is basically an object's movement through space. Okay, so it's proportional. So the relationship between, the object moving through space is measured in time. So an object travels a mile in what we would designate an hour. It travels that same distance in 3 hours. All right, okay, it's 3 times as slow. Okay, because now it's take 3 hours to travel the same distance. That's the idea, is there's a relationship between space and time. And most theories in physics would at least acknowledge that much. The question is, though, is whether this relationship that we attribute to bodies and motion, is that appearance of motion, does it exist in the mind, or is it actually in objects independent of any perceiver? Now, can anybody tell me how he defines time?
Is not time measured by the succession of ideas
Yes.
in our minds?
Yes. Does anybody have an idea what he might mean by that? What would he mean? What could he possibly mean by that?
Well, it's kind of like frames in a camera, a picture or something like that. That's kind of how he's, describing time.
Is he being accurate with this? How do we measure time? Not just, don't think of just like clocks in a mechanistic way, but how do we, even if we had no clock when we were out in the woods, or even if we were in a cave, okay, and we couldn't even see the sun, how would we conceive that time is passing?
Succession of moments.
From one moment to the next.
You're right, but what's a moment? Is it the succession of ideas? Is it an idea, a moment? Like, is the movement of my thought, okay, I'm no longer thinking about a chair, now I'm thinking about a rose bush, now I'm thinking about my wife, I wish I could get out of this cave, and 5 minutes later, man, I gotta poop, I don't know where to go in the cave, I'm not gonna fall into a pit. Like, you have no, like, you're going through a succession of ideas. Now, is this a way you gauge time? Man, time's really, feels like it's been going slow. That moment when I was thinking about the rose bush seems like forever ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, also, when let's say you're at work, for those of us who work, some days, okay, now this is the standard 8-hour shift we designated, okay, let's say I start at 5 in the morning, which I do, and then I get off work at 1:30, okay, some days it feels like, man, what is going on here? Did somebody just turn back the time? Did God stop the sun in the sky? Other days, it's like, man, I feel like I didn't even get a chance to even hardly do anything. Now it's time to go home. Now, then the guy next to me, I could be talking to him, and he could say, man, the day's dragging. I was like, well, it flew by for me. Time flies when you're having fun. Now, is there a relationship to the way we're thinking about our day, the way we're going through our day, mentally speaking, determines the feeling of time to us?
Yeah.
This is, I think, what Berkeley's getting at, even with counting. Counting are these ideas in the mind. You're thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're counting in your head. You're going through a succession of thoughts. Frame 1, designated 1. Frame 2, designated 2. You're moving through this succession. That is how you're understanding time. Now, we arbitrarily, now by arbitrary means that there's not any justification at all. It's sort of like we use the word tree to refer to like a perennial wooden plant. The word tree doesn't, there's nothing about the perennial wooden plant that means it has to be a tree. It's just a word we use. Similarly, we use numbers to refer to movements of the sun. Now, we didn't have to use numbers. Maybe we could have used letters. Okay, this is A o'clock. But we decided to use numbers. So numbers are a designation to refer to other things we're perceiving. However, I think the general idea always reduces back to this, is that there's a succession of a feeling in my mind. That's how I conceive of time, the movement of my ideas. Now, can anybody give me some objections to that? Or do you think, relatively speaking, that's sort of how we conceive of time?
Well, yeah, I would say yes, but I guess with time is different than distance. I would say.
What do you mean by distance?
Well, I mean, we were talking about the one. Space, like
time and space.
Travel.
Well,
Yeah.
the relationship there is, can you conceive of, let's say, well, a lot of times the reason they talk about in physics is because you can't ever travel through space without also traveling through time. That's usually the question. Can you conceive of an object traveling through space that is not also going through time? In physics, I know of no such examples.
What we mean when we say God is outside of time.
Well, I think that's something that we're going to have to, it's going to be further down the study, what we mean by that. Because, seriously, and Edwards too has interesting conceptions of space. In fact, he would say that we think of space as far as mentally in relationship to other objects. Like, if I saw no other objects, that if there was no objects, I wouldn't have a concept in my mind of space. I know space is a relationship between different things. So I know that object being larger is closer to me than that couch.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if there was no furniture in here at all, there was no room, no trees, no fields, no nothing, I wouldn't have a concept of space. I know space and distance in relationship to objects. This actually brings up an interesting example. In World War I, actually I think it was World War II. Well, anyway, they were fighting over the sea, and certain ships would get shot down, and they would tell the men to parachute once they realized that they were 60 feet from the water. That was their training. Now, when they parachuted, they had no points of reference over the sea. There was no buildings, no trees to estimate how far they were. So they were ejecting from their parachutes too early. And they were falling maybe 150 feet breaking their legs and getting killed hitting the water. But they thought they were 60 feet, but they couldn't designate the distance because they had no points of reference. Now I'm getting into a rabbit trail, but the point is that we know of space in relationship to other objects. We know of time in the succession of ideas, and as he talked about secondary qualities, an object is its sensible qualities.
Because you could say with time, well, okay, it might go by faster for you than it does for me, but there's still time is still going by, and whether or not it goes by faster for me today or it goes by slower for me tomorrow, it's still passing. It doesn't matter, if I get up at 8 o'clock and I'm working until 12, the sun is still time is still passing no matter what I'm doing.
Yes.
I could be thinking about nothing, and does that mean that time is not passing?
Well, I think we have to get into, that's going to get later into understanding. The philosophy of time, I would probably argue, is the most difficult area of philosophy. And Berkeley's only going to touch on it. Edwards only touches on it. Augustine spends considerable time on it in the Confessions. But I think even Augustine kind of embarrassedly admits that. And he even says that if you ask me what time is, I don't know what it is. If you don't ask me, I do know what it is. That was Augustine's response. What is time? And that's and Berkeley, I think, is getting as close as we can, is how do you measure time? And he's talking about relation, and this is coming back to the relationship of motion, we don't want to keep that out, is the movement of ideas in succession. So if you were unthinking, would you have a concept of time? If you could not think, well, I think that's an obvious. If you can't think, you can't conceive of time. You don't know that anything's happening to you.
Yeah,
But that's the idea. That's the idea is, how do we know of time? We know of time as a succession of ideas.
Yeah.
And with an object...
There's a big problem with that when you try to talk about ideas existing in the mind, and then you try to see that all sum up in God.
Right. Which I would say that would be, once again, the essence of eternality, but we have to think that God sees the world in a holistic sense. This is what Augustine said, because people had objected to him and say, well, what did God do before creation? And that was the question he asked him, what did he do before that? Well, that's a question that assumes time right off the bat, chronology. Before time, that's begging the question in a sense. And Augustine said, well, first he quoted from a priest that responded to the same objection using Carthaginian humor, said, well, God was creating hell for people who ask such questions. And the idea, though, that Augustine tried to answer it seriously, he says that you can't think of God as before and after time, you have to think of him outside. He sees time from its conception, from beginning to end, in one holistic sense.
But then he wouldn't be constrained by time.
No. But we're talking about us right now, our minds, and our minds are contingent and dependent. Okay, so is God revealing the holistic idea that he has in his head into segments into our individual minds? I would say
we're talking about minds, aren't we?
Yes, minds.
So isn't that including God's mind as well?
You're right, but would you say this comes down to like the univocal versus analogical distinction in knowledge? Is God's idea of time the exact same as ours? No,
Of course
not by
not.
any stretch. Well, that's the point. So we can't say minds in general, his mind is the exact same mind as ours. Now I would say, if you're defining consciousness, it's the same, that he is aware, and so are we. If you were just to talk about awareness, God's mind, he's aware, we're aware. That's our commonality. But his understanding of things is much different than ours, and time would be definitely included in that. Same thing with space. But we're getting off topic. With motion, objects moving through time, and his standard of time is, of course, the succession of ideas in our head. Now, what is his argument against the idea of motion being an object? Does anybody know this from the text? What he used?
Against motion being an object. Was it? I don't remember. Was it the same body may seem to perform its motion over space in half the time than it does to you? Is that, and the same reasoning will hold as to the other portion to say, according to your principle, since the motion perceived are both real and the object is possible, one and the same body shall be really moved the same way at once, or both very swift and very slow.
Now, here's where the example. Now, like I said, the primary quality is going to be the most difficult. But what his point is with is what I would call hypothetical relativity in this. This is where he talks about different spirits. Here, he's talking about different forms of consciousness. Now, he used a similar argument with secondary qualities. Okay, for instance, if color was in a flower, and we would say that bees see an ultraviolet spectrum. Well, whose perception of the flower is correct if the sensations are in the object? If color is in the object, then color presenting itself, the object presenting itself to my mind would be the same for me and other types of beings that are perceiving that object. Now, the big question is, though, here, when he's applying it to motion is, okay, if, let's say, a creature that lives but 3 days in its entire span of life, its conception of time measured against its own understanding, against its own succession of ideas, the whole span of its life is 3 days. So its understanding of one day is much different than our understanding of one day. So similarly, objects moving, which are moving through time, remember, the relationship between time and space is established by 1 mile in 1 hour, 1 mile in 3 hours. That's the idea of motion, is movement through time, distance-time relationship. If that be the case, and we measure something fast by measuring time, if its time is different for an animal that lives about 3 days, the speed of that object would be different for that animal as well.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's the argument he's using there.
Well, no, that the latter part you read. The part where he said about different spirits perceiving it differently.
Seems to be using an identity argument there, saying like the same argument that was used before, where with hot and cold.
Yes, absolutely.
Where he's saying,
he uses
saying
both.
It's impossible to. I mean, he's saying by your standards, you could be doing the same thing and have two things going on.
Right. So, like, if you perceive an object, and okay, especially if you're at a different distance. If I'm at a distance from an object and I see it coming towards me, like especially the cars on the interstate. Now, if I'm stepping back and I'm observing a car on the interstate from a good distance, the cars don't seem quite as fast to me when I'm right up next to the road. And they're zooming by me. Now, if motion as I perceive it is in the object, there would be a constancy in the way I perceive that motion. Now, that would be the identity argument.
Yeah.
So I'd be saying that, well, is perceiving something to be moving slow, like if you're on a mountaintop, you can see a car in the distance, and then when I'm up close and it zooms right by me, if motion was in the object itself, the way the object reveals itself to my mind would be the same. But slowness and swiftness can't be in the object at the same time. It's a violation of identity. So yeah, that'd be the identity argument. Go ahead.
But wouldn't there be a problem with that argument in the fact that we are consciously interpreting that motion?
If we were to say that, now I think that asks a question of whether our conscious activity is, like for instance, am I reaching out to see something independent of me and interpreting in that?
Or the other way around.
Or, well, if it's the other way, then it's being revealed to my mind passively. So it's revealed to my mind at one frame, slowly, like me being at a distance, looking down on the mountain, and then, let's say, we'll designate moment 2, where I'm by the road, it's fast. So if it's in the object, it's going to be constant either moment. But if I'm passive and it's being, I'll use Edwards' term, revealed to my mind, then it's revealed differently in one moment and revealed differently in another. But because it's not in an object, it's in my mind, in a sense you have two different frames. It'd be like the idea of, well actually I don't even think I need an example to slice the point unless you have an objection.
Well, I'm just thinking that the motion of the car is the same, whether you're standing next to the road or whether you're on the mountaintop. It's the way your consciousness is perceiving it.
Well, that's the point.
Right.
But that's the point. That's the point he's arguing. That's the point he's making. Yes, the point he's making is that it's different for the way you're perceiving it. Now, if you're saying that once, and this goes back to some of the earlier studies too, and I have some videos online that you can check out that go over all this. If it's in the object, and the object is presenting itself to that's presentational realism. If it's presenting itself to my mind, and it's in its object, it's showing forth part of its being to me. So, and if motion is part of its essential being, and it's revealing itself to my mind, it's going to be constant. It would be the same idea of if I were to drink, now with, let's say, taste. If I were to drink, let's say, a cup of orange juice, and it's like a sweetness to it. And then I drink lemon juice, and it's got bitterness. Well, then I go drink that orange juice again. Now it's really sweet. Now, if sweetness was in the orange juice, it would remain constant, regardless of any intermediate event, if it was in the object.
Well, there's an interference with your taste buds at that point. The point is not that it's not sweet. The point is that the taste buds are being interfered with by the lemon juice.
Well, the question is, though, why would that change the
You're
orange
assuming
juice?
the purity of the senses.
I think Berkeley is.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But the purity of the senses is either, here's how you depend on the purity of the senses. It depends on your metaphysical assumption now. Is sensation correlating to objects in flux, and on, of course, let's say, the physical nature of my body, or is the whole of perceptual reality being directly revealed the way God wants it to be revealed to my mind at a particular moment? Now, this is eventually the point Berkeley is going to be trying to get at. But let's say that, and once again, a lot of the stuff what I had to cover before, and I don't want to spend too much time getting into it right now.
Okay.
I'll try. No problem. No, I'll try to answer some more later. But let's move on for the moment to solidity. Now, how does he deal with solidity?
It be evident what seems hard to one animal may appear soft to another who has greater force and firmness of limbs, nor is it less plain that the resistance I feel is not in the body. Okay, so he's saying that one animal, like for instance a monkey, is gonna have different feeling, feel things different than, say, a lion.
Yeah. Well, and you could say that he's reducing solidity to tactile sensation.
Yeah.
So, which we had covered in secondary qualities.
Yeah.
So, if you're saying, okay, well, solidity, and he refers to resistance, which is a Newtonian term, and hardness. So, when you push up against it, that's resistance that you're feeling when you touch it. Well, he goes, that reduces to the idea of touch, to tactile sensation. You can't really distinguish this as a primary quality from a secondary quality. You go ahead.
So basically what he's trying to do here is he's taking each of these primary qualities and trying and bunching them in with the secondary qualities.
Yeah, he's saying you can't really just...
can't
And I think common sense would tell us that.
Yeah.
I think common sense would say that if you can't see, taste, smell, touch, whatever, you would have no idea or conception of extension or weight or anything like that. It's like saying that can I be unconsciously be conscious of something? It's quite contradictory. And I think that's sort of what Berkeley's ultimately going to be getting at. But so it reduces to tactile sensation, but what he's pointing out with the relativity there is, I mean, you can kind of imagine a guy saying, oh man, this brick is really hard. Arnold Schwarzenegger, it just crumbles. And I think the idea is to say that, okay, well, is the brick hard? Remember, we're talking about, and this actually might go back to a little bit to what we're talking about with the orange juice, is we're not just talking about, let's say, an arbitrary designation of measurement. So let's say, because I used to use a gauge at work called a hardness tester for metal. It would actually tell you, because we used powdered metal, we ran it through a kiln, and it would fuse together, and then to know that the quality of the fusing was correct, you used a hardness tester, and it would measure hardness. Okay, it took like a little thing, and it would just push against it at a certain weight, and it would trip a sensor if it wasn't correct. Now, that is sort of like how we designate temperature. Okay, so we could, like, for instance, with water, we say, well, we designate that as 65 degrees. Now, why do we use the temperature scale? Well, we usually use water as our standard. Boiling would give a number, and freezing point will give a number. And that's sort of like our starting points. And then from there, we'll create a spectrum. Celsius making more sense than Fahrenheit. But the idea is that we're not talking about hardness in that sense as a designation we give, or the temperature is a designation we give. those presuppose already that we begin the process of observation. So, for instance, with hardness, well, how do you determine, well, what's hard? Well, what's hard at all to begin with?
Yeah.
Now, is it, okay, we'll say, well, it's a composition, it's the density, it's the amount of, particles in a space. Okay, well, what makes that hard? Well, every time we see those particles in that amount of space, it's hard. Eventually you're going to reduce it down to primitive observation. And I think that's really what we got to get down to, and I think the same thing would apply with juice. You could probably measure sweetness with a sugar count. Okay, so orange juice is sweet because, let's say, how many fructose is in it, and then you go to lemon juice, have a similar calculation, and then orange juice again. But now, once again, the designation hasn't changed, but now has the ingredients of the lemon juice interfere. But I think that, once again, what he's saying here is the experience. Okay, a subjective experience. Why, if the sweetness is what determines my experience of it, why is my experience no longer correlating in the same way to the designated amount? If they're directly causally related, not just correlated. So, for instance, 65 degrees typically feels what I would call lukewarm. However, if I have one hand that was outside and I put it in that same water, that water feels warm now. But a hand by the heater, the water feels cold. Now, the number we've arbitrarily designated is, let's say, 65 degrees. Okay? So the designated number hasn't changed, but the way we've even determined that number typically is based on these previous sense experiences. I've observed water freezing. I call that 32 degrees. However, if I spent my whole day in Antarctica, 32 degrees is going to feel really nice compared to, let's say, what it would feel like right now to me. And so that's the idea. We're talking about subjective experience and how that correlates to being in the object. So he uses the relativity and identity argument here and solidity. But now this is where, the reason I think he spent so little time in this part of the dialogue on all this stuff is because this is what he really wants to get to. All of it supposes, or presupposes, I guess, extension. The argument against extension was sort of the ones that we were talking about before, but it was the strongest of his primary qualities argument. The relative perception of a building, okay, from this distance, small, get up close, it's big. If it's actually the experience of size is in the object, it would be the same. And so he went through the whole list of critiques against extension, and he says, can you conceive of solidity or motion apart from an extended object? Can you? There's no such thing as shape in any sense whatsoever. Can you conceive of something moving or something having solidity? That's the idea. So he's saying that if we've already demonstrated that extension's in the mind, then really my review, all these arguments so far were just for the heck of it. In reality, I can just take my argument for extension and just refute all these. If extension's in the mind, so must all these, because they necessarily presuppose extension. So, and that's why he didn't spend much time on these. He wanted to, here's some of the other arguments that we could use for these, like I did with the other ones, but in the end, they all kind of just fall under extension.
Yeah.
So, not to say that our conversation tonight wasn't edifying, but it was, that's the point. Now, there's another thing that you see that Hylas gets into. He talks about absolute extension versus sensible extension. Can anybody give me an idea of what he's getting at? What do you think that Hylas is getting at here?
He's trying to distinguish between secondary and primary, right? Extension. Is that what he's trying to do?
In a sense, he's trying to maintain that position. He wants to try to get that, reclaim
so
that, especially after that.
By sensible extension, he means that which is perceived, and then by what was the other one he said? Absolute extension, that which is real, really.
You're right. So, like for instance, me with a building. Okay.
Yeah.
He's saying that. Okay, yes, I'll grant that there's extension that exists in the mind, the sensible extension. It's small at one moment. I get up next to the building. It's big. Okay. However, that's the perceived part. We'll lay that aside. That's perceived extension. But that object actually has an extension in and of itself that we don't know about in a perceivable sense, what he calls absolute extension. Now, what's Hylas's critique of this? This is all going to be, all these next arguments are going to be under the concept of abstract. He's critiquing abstract notions.
You say, pray, what is it that distinguishes one motion from another? It is not something sensible.
Yeah, these qualities, therefore stripped of all sensible properties, are without all specific and numerical differences.
Yes, that's the point. What he's getting at here is, and I actually use an object illustration here. Let's say you take a snowball.
Okay.
Okay, you remove
Yeah.
whiteness, roundness, coldness, wetness, any feeling of weight, any sensible qualities. What do you have left that you know of? Nothing.
Nothing.
That's the idea. Now, what absolute extension is, and what he's trying to get at is, okay, you're saying that there's an extension independent of the extension that I perceive. Okay, we'll take away perceived qualities from the object. What extension do you have left?
Nothing.
You know, it's like saying, see that the black line? Erase that. What extension is there left? Nothing. That's the point. He's saying absolute extension as a concept refers to particular extensions. Okay, so it's basically a catch-all term to refer to particulars. That's what his language of talking about things existing in the particular is about. He's saying that when we know of objects, we know of them as particulars. The concept refers to particulars. It's like the one and the many argument. Similarly, he talks about the perceptual nature of ideas. Now, Hylas makes an objection about, just what? Does anybody remember that point?
I think I was laughing so much.
Yeah.
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 Finalist says, can you even separate the ideas of extension and motion from the ideas of all those qualities which they who make the distinction term secondary? And then Finalist goes, what is it? Is it not an easy matter to consider extension and motion by themselves abstracted for all their sensible qualities? How did mathematicians treat of them?
Okay, well, what's his point here? Okay, what's Hylas in getting at here? Bringing up mathematical qualities. Any idea?
Well, he's talking about a priori. So.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Okay, so for instance, if you were to take motion, okay, for instance, we think of motion as observing an object moving through space. Okay, and that's, of course, we determine time, and etc. Now, what Hylas is bringing up is, okay, the abstract. Time, motion might be a calculation like time times something, whatever. Okay, some sort of mathematical formula. He goes, you don't have to think about an invisible object moving through time to write a formula. How the mathematicians do it, Or we don't have to refer to volume by thinking about an object with a space inside of it. Okay, we don't have to think of volume in sensible secondary quality terms. We can think of volume as the mathematical equation for volume. He goes, so therefore, isn't this an objection that those things that we're referring to are independent, are conceivable apart from the secondary qualities? What's Finalist's response?
He says, how does it follow that because I can pronounce the word motion by itself, I can form the idea of it in my mind exclusive of body?
Okay. Does anybody understand what he's being real snide about this? What's his criticism? His criticism is that all these formulas mathematicians bring up would be meaningless if they had no reference to something in reality. Okay, so for instance, let me give you an example using, I would say, the universal primary law of logic. Okay? Well, there's three cardinal laws of logic, but I'm going to use, let's say, the law of non-contradiction. Oops, non-A. Okay, A does not equal non-A. Okay, now this law applies to various particulars. Okay, so a chair is not a bed. Okay, there's particulars to which the law applies. This is sort of like what Hyles is bringing up with other mathematical formulas having to do with, motion or whatever. However, reality is about the particulars, is what Hyles is trying to say. So, for instance, if I had no writing, I could not write A or non-A. I couldn't write any of this. I didn't have any perceivable objects, no chalkboard, no tables, no floors, nothing. If I had no perceptual knowledge of my own body, if I had none of that, would this law have any meaning to me? Would the law have any meaning to me if there was no objects? If there was nothing to distinguish? If all was pure unity or nothingness, would that law even matter? That's the point. He goes, the law has relationship to particulars. There's a simultaneous relationship between unity and diversity. Those of you who are familiar with Cornelius Van Til, in the one of the many argument, it actually goes back even further. Edwards talks about it in relation to this very problem. The relationship between these abstract concepts that we come up with are always related to the particulars. You can't conceive of the abstract fully apart from the particular. You can write it out, just like you say the word motion. I can say the word motion and create a proposition even. However, if I have no concept of bodies moving, that word is meaningless. That's the point. He's saying that these abstract concepts are meaningless without the particular. That's the issue at hand. And this goes on with mathematical concepts. So now I want to get to, we've actually been doing kind of question and answer throughout for the benefit of people that are new to the study, but this is a time now to throw out some more questions and have some more discussions. What do you think about this general, now for those who want to go back through the secondary qualities, you might just think this is all a bunch of crazy nonsense. However, at this point, what do you think of his arguments so far that he's made?
Pretty solid,
What do you think?
I would say.
Well, in my own perception of things, I think he's onto an idea. I'm just curious about how he understands the objective world. Is there
You're right.
an objective world?
Yes. No, and that's something we're going to be getting into. I don't want to spoil too much.
Okay.
But yeah, there is a basis for objectivity.
Yes, exactly.
And I think one of the things to keep in mind, and I can speak more boldly because everybody in this study tonight is Christian. I've had unbelievers come, and so some of these ideas are like, whoa, what are you talking about? For Edwards and for Berkeley, we're going to be reading Edwards' works along with this stuff from time to time later, once I get this groundwork laid, especially his essay, The Mind, and also other works like Of Being that he's written, his philosophical works. Edwards would pretty much say that it's not the objectivity, all objectivity in reality has to find its grounding in God. So objectivity is not found in material bodies independent of a mind. What is objective, what is common, what we can say is there, our common reference point, is fully based on our assumption of God. And I think some philosophers and theologians at this time have already kind of started to stumble upon that. I think Van Til was onto that a little bit, that, without presupposing God, that knowledge basically leads to skepticism or relativism. Mm-hmm. But I really do think that Van Til was reviving the starting point of something that was already established earlier in other theologians that's been lost. It really has. So, and I think there was a decline in education and knowledge, especially in Christian circles. Mm-hmm. So Van Til's getting back to the point that we need to presuppose the Word of God as our primary starting point, and then from that, that's how we understand reality. Now, a lot of people will say, well, Berkeley's an Enlightenment philosopher. And I think it's hard to make a strong distinction that people want to make, well, got Enlightenment over here, Reformation over here. Berkeley was a bishop in the young Anglican Church. And Berkeley was responding against atheism and skepticism in a defense of Christianity. Now, why? Now, one of the ways that we characterize Enlightenment versus Reformation is, well, one starts with reason, one starts with Scripture. However, in this book, Hylas and Philus are both Christian. They both, in fact, objections are going to come up later in the dialogue. Says, okay, well, how does this work with creation from Genesis? Like, how is this discussion? Like, how can you account for that? How can you account for the problem of evil? The biblical questions are going to get brought up and discussed. So I think it's unfair to say, okay, well, these guys are starting from reason. In reality, both men had already started on Scripture. They already believed it. They were assuming that the other guy was Christian. What they were discussing is what's the nature of general revelation. And then I think Edwards would actually really say, what does it mean to be revelation? And that's sort of what this discussion is about, is to rethink reality, think of reality as revelation, as communication, self-expression from the supreme mind, Trinitarian supreme mind, to the minds of his beings. That's the idea. I don't know if that helps to answer your question. That's going to be the ground of objectivity that we're going to get to. Whether it's sound, I think it's going to be for debate. Any other questions? So do you think he handles primary qualities fairly well?
I think it's fair to say that primary qualities and secondary qualities can't really be they can't really be separate. They can't be separated.
I would agree with that, and I think that the extension argument works that if you can pretty much reduce any experience of taste, smell, sound, if you can reduce those to being mental content as opposed to being physical, then you're going to have a hard time being able to justify things like shape. You take away man's ability to feel, smell, taste, touch, and see. How's he going to know the shape of anything? And I think that's the point that he's getting at. And so all of that kind of gets sucked in under secondary qualities. But the reason the philosophers wanted to maintain that is because a lot of them already started seeing that sensations were mental. I think Locke was really saying, well, okay, but I don't want to give up this mind-independent physical reality that can be explained with its own interactions, which is part of the issue. And this is sort of like, there's going to be an interesting section of this book I want to briefly discuss with you from the introduction, what happened in science, what was predicted by Berkeley to happen, and what did happen. Really interesting. So, but I think just good. So this was a more difficult part of the book. Thanks for bearing with it. We're going to get into some more exciting stuff next week, because there's going to be some fighting going on between Philus and Hylas. So, because Hylas is getting... Well, I'm just going to retract half of what I said. So
The gloves come off.
yeah, and it gets in the next two dialogues it gets even worse. So this is really the gentle stuff. So yeah, I see Hylas is getting excited over there. All right, well, thanks for coming and good night.